The bank teller counted out the last of Marcus Webb's savings with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd processed 1,000 similar transactions, her expression neutral as she slid $420 across the counter in 20s that felt thin as tissue paper. His 8-year-old son Caleb stood beside him, small hand gripping the strap of a backpack that held everything they owned that mattered, both of them understanding without speaking that this money represented the distance between sleeping in a shelter or sleeping in the truck Marcus no longer owned because the repo men had taken it 3 days earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The eviction from their apartment would be final in 48 hours, the sheriff's notice taped to the door alongside 3 months of unpaid rent demands that Marcus couldn't meet on unemployment benefits and pride that wouldn't let him ask his dead wife's family for help. Sarah had been gone 2 years, cancer taking her slowly enough that Marcus had watched every dollar they'd saved disappear into medical bills that bought time but not survival. Her parents had offered money with conditions he couldn't accept, expectations about how he'd raise Caleb that felt like ownership rather than support. So here he stood in a bank in Harborview, Maine, a coastal town he'd driven to because the one ads listed a county foreclosure auction that afternoon. The kind of desperate gamble made by men who'd run out of conventional options, who calculated that $420 spent on property nobody else wanted was better than the same money buying a few more weeks of motel rooms before they ran out completely. The auction was held in the town hall, a brick building that overlooked Harborview Harbor where fishing boats and pleasure craft bobbed in water that smelled of salt and diesel and the sea's ancient patience. The room was sparse, maybe a dozen people scattered across folding chairs, most of them looking like investors or scrappers hoping to acquire metal from industrial buildings. Marcus sat in the back with Caleb, studying the property listings with the kind of focus he'd once applied to blueprints when he'd worked construction before the company went under. Most of the offerings were residential properties with structural problems or commercial buildings with liens that exceeded their value. But one listing made him pause, made his exhausted mind start calculating possibilities he hadn't considered. Riverside Shipyard, 6. 2 acres including main assembly building, dry dock facilities, and machine shop. Built 1903, closed 1982. Requires extensive environmental remediation. Minimum bid $400. The photographs showed a massive structure that looked like a cathedral to industry, its walls corrugated metal over timber framing, its roof peaked high enough to accommodate the tall ships that had once been built beneath it. The dry dock stretched along the Kennebec River where it widened near the harbor, concrete and timber infrastructure that had survived a century of tides and weather. According to the county assessor's notes, the Riverside Shipyard had been founded by a family named Carlisle, had built fishing vessels and small cargo ships through 2 world wars, had specialized in wooden boat construction when most of the industry had moved to steel and fiberglass. It had closed in the early 80s when the last Carlisle died, had sat abandoned since then, accumulating environmental citations for paint contamination and fuel oil residue. The auctioneer worked through properties with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd done this too many times to care about individual stories. When the Riverside Shipyard came up, his voice took on a warning tone that Marcus had learned to recognize as the sound of liability being transferred. Property requires comprehensive environmental assessment and remediation as detailed in county reports. Structure is unsafe for occupation without significant repair. Dry dock facilities are non-operational and may present safety hazards. Minimum bid $400. Marcus raised his hand, his heart hammering against ribs that felt too tight, Caleb's small fingers squeezing his other hand with the kind of trust that terrified him because it meant his son believed he knew what he was doing. $400 from bidder 23. Do I hear $425? The silence that followed felt like judgment, like every person in that room could see Marcus's desperation and was deciding whether to save him from himself or let him commit to catastrophic mistake. Going once at $400. The auctioneer's voice carried practiced neutrality. Going twice. Marcus waited for sanity to intervene, for someone to outbid him and save him from gambling their last money on a building that was probably more liability than asset. Sold to bidder 23 for $400. Caleb looked up at him, his eyes wide with the kind of fear children show when they realize adults don't always know what they're doing. "We bought a shipyard, Dad?" "Yeah, buddy," Marcus said, his voice not quite steady. "We bought a shipyard." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At the clerk's window, he counted out $400 in bills that represented the last of Sarah's life insurance after medical debt had consumed most of it, then added 20 more for transfer fees and processing costs. The clerk, a woman named Dorothy who looked like she'd worked in this building since the shipyard was operational, gave him a long look as she slid the deed across the counter. "The Carlisle place," she said, not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am." Dorothy leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "My husband worked there in the 70s, back when old Thomas Carlisle still ran it. Said Thomas was the finest shipwright in Maine, could build wooden vessels that would outlast steel if you maintained them properly. Place had a reputation though." "What kind of reputation?" "Thomas was secretive about certain aspects of the operation. Kept sections of the shipyard locked, didn't allow workers in specific areas. Some people thought he was building custom boats for clients who didn't want records. Others figured he was just protecting trade secrets." She tapped the deed. "After he died in 1982, there were rumors he'd hidden something valuable. Treasure hunters broke in a few times over the years, never found anything. Just a lot of old tools and sawdust." "Is it safe?" "The building, I mean. For my son." Dorothy's expression softened, seeing Caleb waiting patiently by the door. "Structurally, probably not without inspection and repair. The environmental issues are real but mostly concentrated in areas where they stored paints and oils. As long as you're not disturbing old chemicals or drinking contaminated water, short-term occupation probably won't kill you." She hesitated. "My nephew does building inspections if you want someone honest to tell you what you're actually dealing with." The drive to the shipyard took them along Harbor Road, past fishing docks and marine supply stores and restaurants that catered to tourists who came for Maine's coastal charm. The town had the one quality of places that had peaked economically decades ago, businesses that struggled against chain stores and changing industries that had moved manufacturing overseas. The shipyard sat at the edge of town where the Kennebec River widened before meeting the sea. From the road, it looked almost majestic, a massive building that spoke to an era when things were built to last generations. Up close, the decay was more evident. Broken windows, rust bleeding through paint on metal panels, sections of siding that had pulled away from the frame. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate stood open, its padlock cut away long ago by salvagers or vandals. Marcus parked the borrowed truck, a favor from a former coworker that came with the understanding it needed to be returned tomorrow, in the gravel lot where workers had once arrived for shifts building vessels that would challenge the Atlantic. "It's really big," Caleb said, his voice carrying equal parts awe and uncertainty. "It is. Probably too big for us to use most of it. But we'll find a space that's safe, make it work until we figure out what comes next." They approached the main entrance carefully, stepping around rusted equipment and broken glass. The door was secured with a newer padlock, and the key Dorothy had given Marcus turned smoothly despite the building's general decay. Inside, the shipyard was vast and overwhelming. The main assembly floor stretched out like an aircraft hangar, high ceilings supported by timber beams that looked hand-hewn from old-growth trees. The dry dock was visible through open doors at the far end, a concrete channel that had once been flooded to float completed vessels into the river. Wooden skeletons of partially built boats remained, abandoned mid-construction when Thomas Carlisle had died and the operation had shut down overnight. Tools hung on walls in organized rows, covered in dust but still suggesting the order of someone who'd valued craftsmanship. The smell hit Marcus immediately, old wood and salt air and oil, decades of maritime work soaked into the building's bones. Light filtered through broken windows and gaps in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Caleb stayed close to Marcus, both of them processing the scale of what he'd committed them to. "There's stairs," Caleb said, pointing to a metal staircase that climbed to what appeared to be a second-floor office level. We'll check them carefully. Buildings this old, you can't trust everything is still safe. They climbed slowly, Marcus testing each step before allowing Caleb to follow. The second floor held administrative spaces, offices where the business side of shipbuilding had happened while construction work filled the floors below. Most rooms were empty except for debris and water damage from the leaking roof. One office was larger than the others, with windows overlooking both the assembly floor and the dry dock. A desk remained, its surface warped by moisture but still intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall, most hanging open and empty. A framed photograph hung askew, showing a stern man in work clothes standing beside a beautiful wooden sailing vessel, the kind of craft that looked more like art than transportation. "Is that Mr. Carlyle?" Caleb asked. Marcus examined the photograph more closely. Thomas Carlyle had the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors, his expression serious, his posture suggesting pride in the vessel beside him. The photograph was dated 1979, 3 years before the shipyard closed. He turned to study the actual office, finding the walls covered with technical drawings of various vessels, building specifications pinned to corkboard that had faded with age. Nothing suggested a hidden door or secret space. But when Marcus pulled down some of the drawings to see what was beneath them, he found something that made his pulse quicken. A door frame, boarded over from the inside and then covered so thoroughly with decades of accumulated papers and notices that it looked like solid wall unless you knew to look for it. "Dad, what is that?" Caleb's voice carried curiosity rather than fear. Marcus ran his fingers along the edge of the concealed frame, feeling the seams. This wasn't casual boarding up. This had been deliberate concealment, the kind of thing done by someone who wanted to make sure a door was forgotten entirely. "Help me move these cabinets," Marcus said. Together they pushed the heavy metal units away from the wall, revealing more of the concealed door frame. Marcus used his pocket knife to pry away some of the boarding, finding beneath it a heavy wooden door with an old-fashioned lock. The keys Dorothy had given him included several that looked original to the building rather than modern additions. The second key turned in the lock with resistance that suggested decades of disuse. Marcus pulled the door open carefully, revealing darkness and a narrow staircase descending into what appeared to be the building's foundation. Cool air rose from below, carrying a smell different from the shipyard's general decay. Something metallic and almost clean, like air that had been sealed away from the salt and moisture that affected everything else in the building. Marcus pulled out his phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam revealed stone steps leading down approximately 20 feet before opening into a larger space below. "Stay close," he told Caleb. "I'm not going anywhere," his son said firmly, the kind of stubborn determination Sarah used to show when she'd made up her mind about something. They descended carefully, the stone steps solid despite their age. The stairs ended in a chamber approximately 30 feet square, the walls lined with brick, the ceiling supported by timber beams that looked like they'd been salvaged from old ships. Unlike the shipyard above, this space showed no signs of water damage or decay. It had been sealed so completely that time had barely touched it. Wooden crates lined 3 walls, each one marked with dates and codes Marcus didn't immediately understand. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made his breath catch. A large iron strongbox, maybe 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, sat on a stone platform. Unlike everything else in the shipyard, the strongbox showed signs of recent maintenance, its surface oiled and preserved. A brass plate was affixed to its top, engraved with words Marcus had to lean close to read. "Thomas Carlyle, Master Shipwright. What the sea gives, the land keeps." Caleb squeezed Marcus's arm. "Dad, is that a treasure chest?" "I don't know what it is," Marcus said honestly, though his heart was racing with possibilities he didn't dare voice. "But we need to be very careful about this." He examined the strongbox more closely, finding it had both a combination lock mechanism and what appeared to be a keyhole. None of the keys from his ring seemed to match, and he had no combination. But as he played his flashlight around the chamber, he noticed something else. A leather journal sat on one of the wooden crates, newer looking than anything else in the space, with a note tucked into its cover. Marcus opened the note carefully, finding handwritten text and fading ink. To whoever finds this chamber, the combination is the year this shipyard was founded, followed by the year I was born. The key is hidden where all good ships begin, in the timber that remembers the forest. If you found this place, you've earned what it contains. Use it with more wisdom than I managed. Thomas Carlyle, 1982. Marcus stood in the hidden chamber holding a note written by a dead man, looking at a strongbox that might contain nothing or might contain something that could change everything, feeling the weight of discovery and possibility settle onto shoulders that were already carrying more than they could bear. Above them, the shipyard creaked in the wind, its vast spaces holding secrets Thomas Carlyle had died protecting. The building Marcus had purchased for $420 of money he couldn't spare had just revealed itself to be something far more complicated than an abandoned industrial ruin. And whatever waited in that strongbox, whatever Thomas Carlyle had sealed away in 1982, was about to become Marcus and Caleb's burden to carry forward or their salvation from circumstances that had been grinding them down for 2 years. The chamber waited in silence, its secrets kept for over 40 years, patient as only the buried things can be. Marcus's flashlight beam swept across crates and brick walls and the strongbox that sat like a promise or a threat, depending on what it actually contained. The year the shipyard was founded, 1903, followed by Thomas's birth year. Marcus didn't know when Thomas was born, but the county records would have that information, or the obituary from 1982 would tell him what he needed to know. The key hidden where ships begin, in timber that remembers the forest. Somewhere in this vast building, in the thousands of board feet of lumber that had been shaped into vessels, Thomas had concealed the final piece of his puzzle. Caleb looked up at him with the trust that still terrified Marcus after everything they'd been through. "Are we going to open it?" "Not yet. First we find the key, make sure we understand what we're dealing with. Then we decide together what comes next." They climbed back to the office level, Marcus's mind racing through implications he was trying not to count on. Thomas Carlyle had been wealthy enough to own and operate a successful shipyard, had died under circumstances the county clerk suggested had raised questions, had gone to elaborate lengths to hide something valuable. The strongbox could contain business records or personal papers. Or it could contain something that changed everything for a man who currently had negative dollars in his bank account and 48 hours before the sheriff enforced their eviction. Outside, the November afternoon was fading toward evening, clouds gathering over the harbor that promised rain before morning. The shipyard property extended beyond the main building to include the dry dock and several smaller structures that had probably been storage sheds or machine shops. At the edge of the property, where the land met the river's edge, a line of old-growth timber marked a windbreak that had probably stood for centuries. Marcus studied the trees, looking for the oldest timber. Most were pines and oaks that had probably been planted when the shipyard was established, but one massive oak stood near the river bank, its trunk easily 5 feet in diameter, its branches spreading in patterns that suggested it had been there long before Thomas Carlyle built his first vessel. "That one," Caleb said, pointing to the same tree Marcus had identified. They approached it as rain began to fall, cold drops that promised the kind of weather that would make camping in an unheated building miserable. Near the oak's base, partially hidden by exposed roots and decades of accumulated leaves, Marcus found something that made his hands shake. A flat stone, maybe 2 feet square, set deliberately into the ground and marked with a simple carved anchor. The stone covered a metal box embedded in the soil, sealed with wax that had cracked with age but had apparently kept moisture out for over 40 years. Marcus pried it loose with his knife, feeling the weight of something substantial inside. The box opened to reveal a key wrapped in oilcloth, perfectly preserved, ornate and old-fashioned in the way of locks built to last generations. Caleb watched with focused intensity, understanding they were participating in something that went beyond simple discovery. Mr. Carlyle really didn't want anyone to find this unless they looked hard. No, he didn't. Marcus pocketed the key, looking back at the shipyard that loomed against the darkening sky. Which means whatever's in that strongbox, he believed it was worth protecting this way. As they walked back toward the building, a truck pulled into the gravel lot, newer and cleaner than anything else in this part of Harborview. 2 men got out, both wearing clothes that were too clean for actual work, their posture suggesting they weren't here for friendly conversation. Marcus put himself between them and Caleb instinctively, his free hand finding his phone in his pocket. "You're the one who bought this place at auction," the older man said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Name's Richard Brennan. This is my son James. We've got a business proposition that could save you a lot of trouble." Marcus kept his voice neutral, watching the two men approach with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to recognize threat beneath politeness. "I just bought the property yesterday. Haven't even had time to assess what I'm dealing with. That's why we're here. Save you some trouble." Richard pulled a folded paper from his jacket, his movements practiced. "We're offering to buy the shipyard from you. $25,000, transfer happens within 2 weeks. You walk away with a profit and don't have to deal with environmental cleanup or the fact that this building's one good storm away from collapse. $25,000. 2 days ago, that would have seemed like salvation. Even now, it represented security Marcus hadn't had in 2 years. But the timing was too convenient, the offer too prepared. These men had been waiting for someone to buy the shipyard at auction, had come ready with an offer that suggested they knew something about the property's value. "Why do you want it?" Marcus asked. "Development opportunity. The land itself is valuable waterfront property. Building needs to be demolished, but the location is prime for condos or marina expansion." Richard's tone was reasonable, but his eyes were calculating. "We're offering fair value for a property with massive liabilities. The environmental remediation alone will cost you hundreds of thousands. You're in over your head, and we're giving you an out." James spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge his father's didn't. People who refuse help when it's offered sometimes find things getting more difficult. Permits get delayed, inspections find problems. Coastal towns can be complicated for outsiders who don't understand how things work. Marcus felt Caleb press against his back, his son's small hand gripping his jacket. The threat was barely veiled, the kind of pressure applied by people used to getting what they wanted through intimidation when money didn't work immediately. "I need to think about it," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "You've got 72 hours. Richard handed him the paper. "After that, the offer expires and you're on your own with all the problems this place brings." After they left, Marcus stood in the gravel lot holding an offer for money he desperately needed, rain beginning to fall harder now, knowing that accepting it meant surrendering whatever Thomas Carlyle had hidden in that chamber. The Brennans had been waiting for someone to buy the shipyard, had come prepared to pressure a quick sale, which meant they knew or suspected something about what the building contained. "Are we going to sell?" Caleb asked quietly. "I don't know yet. But we're not deciding until we know what we actually have." That night, they camped in the shipyard's least damaged office space, using sleeping bags Marcus had kept from better days and a camping stove to heat canned soup. The rain hammered on the metal roof, finding every gap and leak, dripping into buckets Marcus positioned around their makeshift shelter. It wasn't comfortable, probably violated every safety regulation in existence, but it was theirs, and it was shelter when the alternative was sleeping in a truck he had to return tomorrow. After Caleb fell asleep, Marcus sat in the darkness thinking about the combination Thomas Carlyle had left. The year the shipyard was founded, 1903, followed by Thomas's birth year. He didn't know Thomas's birth year, but Dorothy at the courthouse might, or the obituary would have that information. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the strongbox and what it might contain and whether the Brennans' offer was legitimate or whether they were trying to steal something valuable from someone too desperate to fight back. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and descended to the hidden chamber alone, his phone's flashlight illuminating the space Thomas Carlyle had sealed away. The wooden crates lining the walls contained ship's logs and technical drawings, decades of meticulous documentation of every vessel built at the shipyard. Marcus pulled one log from the early 1900s, finding page after page of construction details, notes about materials and methods, a business run with precision and pride. He found Thomas's birth year in a log from 1920, March 15, 1920, son of Jonathan Carlyle, born into the shipbuilding business that would define his life. Which meant the combination was 1903 to 1920. Marcus stood before the strongbox, his hands trembling as he worked the combination mechanism. Right to 19, left to 03, right to 19, left to 20. The lock mechanism clicked with surprising smoothness, suggesting Thomas had maintained it even as the rest of the shipyard decayed. Marcus inserted the key he'd found beneath the oak tree, and it turned with the same well-oiled precision. The strongbox lid lifted heavy on hinges that had been built to last, revealing contents that made Marcus's breath catch. Not gold bars or jewelry or the kind of treasure he'd half expected. Instead, stacked neatly inside, were bundles of currency and what appeared to be gold coins in protective sleeves. Old $100 bills bound with paper bands, and alongside them, rows of American gold eagles and older double eagle coins that gleamed in the flashlight beam. Marcus pulled out one bundle of bills, his hands shaking now. The bills were real, were old but preserved, were 50 of them bound together with a note that read 1982 final liquidation. He counted bundles, his mind struggling with mathematics that seemed impossible. At least 100 bundles of bills, maybe more. In the gold coins, he counted at least 200 one-ounce gold eagles, plus dozens of the older double eagles that would be worth their weight in gold plus collector value. Conservative estimate, $500,000 in currency, possibly another $300,000 to $400,000 in gold depending on current prices. Maybe more. Thomas Carlyle had converted his entire operation to tangible assets before closing, had hidden it in his chamber, and had died before retrieving it or telling anyone where it was. For over 40 years, nearly $1 million in cash and gold had sat beneath a building nobody wanted, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed shipyard at auction. Marcus sat on the cold stone floor, surrounded by more wealth than he'd earned in 50 years of construction work, trying to process what this meant. The Brennans knew. Or suspected. Their $25,000 offer was an insult if they knew what was actually hidden here, or it was a gamble if they only suspected and wanted to acquire the property to search properly. But the assets were legally his. The property transfer had been legitimate, and anything contained on the property belonged to the new owner unless specifically excluded. Thomas's note had been clear, to whoever finds this chamber, which meant it had been intended as inheritance for someone, even if Thomas hadn't known who. Dawn found Marcus still in the chamber, having inventoried everything, having photographed it all for documentation, having read through more of Thomas's logs looking for context. The story that emerged was of a man who'd seen his industry dying, who'd liquidated his operations systematically over several years, converting equipment and inventory and business assets to cash and gold. The logs from 1980 to 1982 showed Thomas preparing for closure, paying off debts, settling with employees, methodically dismantling a business his family had run for nearly 80 years. The final entry, dated February 1982, simply read, "The work ends. The provision waits. May it find hands worthy of the craft." Marcus climbed back to the office level as morning light filtered through broken windows, finding Caleb awake and eating a granola bar from their dwindling supplies. His son took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You opened it." "Yeah." "What was inside?" Marcus sat beside him, choosing honesty because Caleb had earned it through everything they'd survived together. "Money and gold. A lot of both. More than I can really process right now." Caleb's eyes widened. "Like how much?" "Enough that we never have to worry about rent or food or whether we can afford doctor visits. Enough that you can go to any college you want someday. Enough that everything changes." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the seriousness he applied to important things. "But the men yesterday, they want to buy the shipyard because they know about the money." "I think so, yeah. Or they suspect." "So what do we do?" It was the question Marcus had been asking himself since opening the strongbox. The practical answer was to take the money and gold, sell the property to the Brennans for their $25,000, and disappear before anyone realized what had been found. But Thomas's note echoed in his mind, "Use it with more wisdom than I managed." "I need to talk to someone who knew Thomas Carlyle," Marcus said. "Understand why he did this, what he was protecting it for. Then we decide." Dorothy at the courthouse gave him a name, Ernest Porter, who'd been Thomas's foreman for 30 years and still lived in Harborview. Marcus found him in a weathered house overlooking the harbor, a man in his 80s with sharp eyes and clear memories of the shipwright who'd employed him. Thomas was complicated, Ernest said after Marcus explained he'd purchased the shipyard. Brilliant at his craft, terrible at adapting to change. When fiberglass boats started dominating the market, he refused to modify his methods. Said wooden vessels built properly would outlast plastic, which was true but didn't matter when customers wanted cheaper options. He converted everything to cash and gold before closing. Do you know why? Ernest's expression grew guarded. There were rumors. Thomas didn't trust banks after the Depression, even though he was born after it. His father had lost everything in 1929, and Thomas grew up hearing about it. He believed in tangible assets, things you could hold and control. He paused. Did you find something at the shipyard? Marcus made a decision to trust him. A hidden chamber. A strong box. A lot of money and gold that Thomas left behind with a note saying whoever found it should use it with more wisdom than he managed. Ernest's eyes glistened. He did it then. He actually managed to hide his life's work where those vultures couldn't find it. What vultures? The Brennan family. Richard's father was pressuring Thomas to sell in the late 70s, wanted the land for marina development. Thomas refused, said the shipyard represented craftsmanship that mattered more than condos. When Thomas died, the Brennans tried to buy the property from the estate, but the environmental liens made it too complicated. Ernest leaned forward. Richard's been waiting 40 years for that property to go to foreclosure, for someone desperate enough to buy it who he could pressure into a quick resale. He offered me $25,000 yesterday. Which tells you he suspects what's there but hasn't found it himself. Thomas's death was ruled accidental, fell from scaffolding while working on a boat. But there were always questions. Thomas was experienced and careful. Some people thought he was murdered, that someone had tried to force him to reveal where he'd hidden his assets. The implications chilled Marcus. And you think that someone was connected to the Brennan family? I think Thomas died protecting something he believed mattered. The money and gold, yes, but also the principle that his life's work shouldn't be stolen by people who saw it only as real estate. Ernest's expression was fierce despite his age. If you found what Thomas hid, you've inherited more than wealth. You've inherited a fight he died fighting. After leaving Ernest's house, Marcus drove back to the shipyard with Caleb beside him, his mind churning through impossible decisions. The assets could change their lives, but they also made them targets for people who'd been waiting decades to acquire what Thomas had hidden. Selling to the Brennans would be the safe choice, but it would mean surrendering to exactly the kind of pressure Thomas had resisted until death. They found Richard Brennan waiting at the shipyard, his son James and 2 other men with him. Not a social visit. Richard's expression was harder than yesterday, his patience apparently exhausted. Time's up for friendly offers, Richard said. We know you found something. This shipyard has been watched for years, and you've been going places in that building no one's accessed in decades. You're going to sell us this property for what we offered, or you're going to discover how complicated life gets for people who don't cooperate. Marcus felt Caleb press against him, felt the weight of Thomas Carlyle's legacy and his own son's future pulling in different directions. The property's legally mine. Whatever I found is legally mine. You can make threats all you want, but I haven't broken any laws. James stepped forward, his posture aggressive. You think the law matters in Harborview? My family's been here for 4 generations, employs half this town, sits on every board that matters. We can make you wish you'd never heard of this shipyard. Can you? Marcus pulled out his phone, showing the recording he'd started when he saw their trucks in the lot. Because threatening someone on camera, admitting you've been illegally surveilling private property, that seems like the kind of thing that might interest state police. And I've got documentation of everything I found, photographs time-stamped and uploaded to cloud storage. Anything happens to me or my son, it all goes public. Richard's face darkened, but he took a step back, calculating. You're making a mistake. That money isn't yours by right. Thomas Carlyle didn't earn it honestly, he was hiding assets to avoid creditors, cheating people who'd invested in his business. You keep it, you're complicit in fraud. Thomas's logs show every transaction, every debt paid, everything documented properly. He liquidated a legitimate business and chose to keep his assets in tangible form. That's not illegal, just unusual. Marcus kept his voice steady despite his hammering heart. But if you want to claim otherwise, do it through proper legal channels. Until then, stay off my property. After they left, Marcus stood shaking with adrenaline and fear, knowing he'd just made enemies of people who'd been waiting 40 years to get what he'd found. Caleb hugged him tightly, his small frame trembling. "Are we safe?" he asked. "For now. The recording gives us leverage, and they know I've documented everything. They can't just take what they want without risking exposure." Marcus knelt to meet his son's eyes. "But we need to be smart about this. Move the assets somewhere secure, get legal advice, make sure we're protected." That evening, after moving the cash and gold to a safety deposit box in the next county, after consulting with a lawyer who confirmed that found property transferred with legitimate property ownership, after installing security cameras and motion sensors around the shipyard, Marcus sat with Caleb in their makeshift living space. "Thomas Carlyle died protecting this," he said. "Not just the money and gold, but the principle that some things are worth standing for even when powerful people want to take them. I keep thinking about whether I'm strong enough to do what he did." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said something that cut through all his uncertainty. "Mom fought as hard as she could, but cancer doesn't care about fighting. She died anyway. But she never gave up, never stopped trying to stay with us." His voice was small but firm. "You're choosing to stand for something even though it's scary. That's different than giving up. Mom would be proud of that." Marcus pulled his daughter close. No, his son, Caleb was his son, feeling the weight of the boy's trust and the burden of the choice he was making. The money and gold could buy them security, but keeping it meant fighting people who had resources and patience and 40 years of anger driving them. Thomas Carlyle had fought that fight alone and had died for it. But Marcus wasn't alone. He had Caleb, had legal documentation, had evidence of the Brennans' threats and illegal surveillance. He had the truth about Thomas's legitimate business practices, had a community that remembered the shipyard's better days, had the law on his side if he was brave enough to invoke it. Over the next weeks, the Brennans tried different approaches. First came building inspectors who found violations Marcus had to address, then environmental officials who expedited cleanup requirements, then harbor authorities who claimed the dry dock was a navigational hazard. Each challenge was legitimate enough to require a response but time to create maximum pressure and expense. Marcus fought back methodically. He hired Ernest Porter as a consultant, tapping the old foreman's knowledge of the shipyard and connections in the maritime community. He reached out to historic preservation groups, discovering that the Riverside Shipyard was one of the last wooden shipbuilding facilities in Maine with its original equipment intact. They helped him apply for grants to offset environmental cleanup costs. The legal battle escalated when the Brennans filed a civil suit claiming Thomas Carlyle had owed Richard's father money at the time of his death, that the hidden assets should have gone to paying that debt. Marcus's lawyer demolished the claim in court, showing Thomas's ledgers proved all debts had been settled before the shipyard closed. But the real turning point came when a reporter from Portland heard about the case, saw the larger story about historic preservation versus development pressure, about a widow trying to protect a dying craft against a family that wanted beachfront condos. The article made Marcus and Caleb sympathetic figures, made the Brennans look like bullies targeting a grieving father and his young son. Public opinion shifted. People who'd been neutral or mildly supportive of the Brennans started questioning whether the shipyard deserved preservation. The Historical Society rallied support, maritime craftspeople offered help with restoration, the pressure that had felt overwhelming began to ease as the community recognized what was actually at stake. On a cold February evening, 3 months after Marcus had bought the shipyard, Richard Brennan appeared at the property alone. His posture was different this time, less aggressive and more weary, the stance of a man who'd been fighting too long for something he was starting to question. "The environmental cleanup's almost done," Richard said, "not quite a question." Should be certified clear next month. Then you'll have a clean property with no liens. Quite an accomplishment for someone who bought it for $400 at auction. Marcus didn't respond, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. My father spent 40 years trying to acquire this land. Told me stories about how Thomas Carlyle cheated us out of a fair opportunity, how the shipyard should have been ours to develop. Richard looked at the building with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. I believed him, made it my mission to finish what he started. But lately I've been wondering if we were both just chasing something that never mattered as much as we convinced ourselves it did. Why tell me this? Because my son James is starting to talk the same way my father did, making the shipyard into some kind of symbol of family honor that was stolen. I see the same obsession taking root in him that poisoned my father and me. Richard met Marcus's eyes. I'm withdrawing our legal challenges and our interest in this property. No more pressure, no more fights. You won the battle fair, and James needs to learn that some things aren't worth the cost of pursuing. After Richard left, Marcus stood in the shipyard's assembly floor trying to process the strange victory. He'd prepared for continued conflict, for years of legal battles and escalating pressure. The sudden absence of threat felt disorienting, like tensing for impact that never came. Ernest Porter visited that afternoon, his eyes bright with something approaching vindication. Richard Brennan came to see me last week. Asked about Thomas, about what kind of man he'd really been. I think he finally started questioning the stories his father told him. What did you tell him? The truth. That Thomas was stubborn and difficult, but honest. That he closed his business rather than compromise his craft or sell to people he didn't respect. That he died protecting something he believed mattered, not just money and gold, but principles about craftsmanship and quality, and refusing to surrender to people who only saw profit where he saw legacy. Ernest pulled an envelope from his coat. I also have something for you. Thomas gave this to me in early 1982, said if anyone ever found his hidden chamber, I should give it to them. I've been holding it for 42 years, wondering if this day would come. The envelope was sealed with wax, Thomas's initials pressed into it. Inside was a letter written in the same precise hand as the note Marcus had found in the chamber, and reading it, Marcus finally understood what Thomas Carlyle had been trying to preserve, and why it had cost him his life to protect it. The letter was dated January 1982, written in Thomas Carlyle's careful hand, the ink faded but still legible after more than 4 decades sealed away from light and air. To the finder of my provision, if you're reading this, you've demonstrated the kind of thoroughness and attention to detail that I valued in my craft. You found the hidden door that others missed, solved the puzzle I left, claimed what I couldn't bear to entrust to banks or family who never understood what I built here. The money and gold represent 80 years of careful work across 3 generations of Carlyles, my grandfather, my father, and myself. We built vessels that challenged the Atlantic, employed men who took pride in craftsmanship, maintained standards when the industry moved toward cheaper methods. I converted it to tangible assets because I believed in wealth you could hold and count, in security that didn't depend on institutions that might fail. But money alone isn't the inheritance I'm leaving. The real value is in understanding why I did this, why I chose to hide my family's wealth rather than surrender it to people who'd use it to erase what we built. The shipyard represents an era of craftsmanship that's disappearing, of work done with patience and precision and attention to detail that modern manufacturing doesn't value. The Brennans have been pressuring me to sell for years. They see prime waterfront real estate where I see my family's legacy. They want to tear down this building and put up condos, erase 80 years of shipbuilding history for short-term profit. I've refused every offer, but I'm 72 and my heart isn't what it was. I know they'll keep trying after I'm gone. If you're using this inheritance wisely, you're not just enriching yourself. You're honoring a principle that some things matter more than money, that buildings and skills and ways of working deserve protection even when they're no longer economically optimal. Keep the shipyard if you can. Preserve what we built if it's possible. Or at minimum, ensure that whatever replaces it respects the fact that this place represented something beyond simple commerce. I'm dying as I write this, not physically yet but in a way that matters. My life's work is becoming obsolete, my skills irrelevant, my building increasingly empty of purpose. The money and gold are my final act of defiance against that obsolescence, my way of ensuring that at least some value persists even after the craft itself dies. Use it with more wisdom than I managed. I buried it when I should have invested it in teaching others, in preserving the knowledge that dies with my generation. Learn from my mistake. Whatever you do with this inheritance, let it build something rather than simply hide something. Thomas Carlyle. Marcus read the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of Thomas's trust settle onto shoulders that were stronger now than when he'd arrived in Harborview. The money and gold had saved him from immediate desperation, but Thomas's real gift was the understanding that inheritance came with obligation, not legal obligation, but moral imperative to honor the trust placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. The environmental cleanup consumed the next 6 months and cost nearly $200,000 of Thomas's hidden fortune. Marcus worked alongside the remediation specialists, learning about contaminated soil removal and groundwater treatment, watching the shipyard shed its toxic legacy layer by layer. The process was expensive and tedious, but it was also transformative. Seeing the property heal felt like participating in something larger than himself. Caleb adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience of children who'd learned to expect change but had finally found stability. He enrolled in Harborview Elementary, made friends with the ease that came from no longer being afraid of temporary connections. The money meant Marcus could afford proper housing, but Caleb insisted they stay at the shipyard, camping in increasingly comfortable sections as Marcus made each area safe and livable. "This is our place," Caleb said when Marcus suggested renting something temporary. "We found Mr. Carlyle's treasure together. We should stay where it happened." The community's response evolved slowly. Some people remembered Thomas Carlyle fondly, were glad to see the shipyard occupied again. Others were loyal to the Brennan family and treated Marcus with suspicion. The divide revealed itself in small ways: which businesses served him readily, which suddenly had reasons why they couldn't help with various needs. Ernest Porter became an unexpected anchor. He'd worked at the shipyard as a young man, remembered when the assembly floor rang with the sound of mallets and saws, when wooden vessels took shape beneath Thomas's exacting supervision. "Taught me more about quality work in 5 years than I learned anywhere else," Ernest said, helping Marcus assess what equipment could be salvaged. The Brennans wanted this land for decades, but Thomas knew they'd just tear it all down and build something cheap. He believed buildings like this mattered, that craftsmanship deserved respect. Through Ernest, Marcus learned more about Thomas's final years. The man had become increasingly isolated as his industry died, had refused to adapt or modernize, had chosen to close his operation rather than compromise the quality that had defined his work. He'd died alone in the building he loved, officially an accident, though local people debated in quiet conversations whether it had been something darker. The environmental cleanup completed in August, testing showing the property finally clear of contamination that had poisoned the ground for decades. Marcus stood in the assembly floor that afternoon, looking at clean soil where toxic residue had been, feeling something shift. This wasn't just spending money, it was honoring a trust Thomas had placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. The restoration work began that fall, Marcus hiring local contractors who remembered the shipyard's working days and wanted to see it honored rather than demolished. They repaired the roof section by section, replaced broken windows with salvaged glass that matched the original, reinforced structural elements while preserving the building's industrial character. The work was slow and deliberate, motivated not by profit but by the principle Thomas had died protecting. Marcus documented everything, photographing the restoration process, researching wooden shipbuilding to understand what the facility had been designed for. Caleb helped, his interest deepening as he learned about the craft that had filled these spaces. Did people really build entire ships from wood? Caleb asked one evening while examining tools Marcus had restored. Not just little boats, but actual ships that went to sea. Everything from fishing vessels to cargo schooners to racing yachts. Thomas specialized in traditional construction methods, planking in frames and techniques that had been used for centuries. Marcus showed him ship's logs from the 1950s, orders for fishing boats and pleasure craft built to specifications that required master craftsmanship. Could we do that again? Build boats the old way? The question surprised Marcus, opened possibilities he hadn't considered. I don't know how. Thomas's skills died with him, and most of the traditional shipwrights are gone now. But Caleb's enthusiasm planted a seed. Marcus started researching wooden boat building, finding that while the industrial shipbuilding Thomas had practiced was largely extinct, smaller-scale traditional construction was experiencing a revival among craftspeople who valued sustainability and classic design. There were people who still practiced these methods, who taught them, who believed wooden vessels built properly had qualities fiberglass and steel couldn't replicate. He found Catherine Morrison, a master boat builder in New Hampshire who'd apprenticed under one of the last traditional shipwrights. She visited the shipyard in October, her eyes lighting up when she saw the equipment Thomas had left behind. "This is extraordinary," Catherine said, examining the timber-bending equipment and traditional tools that Marcus had carefully preserved. "Most facilities like this were demolished decades ago. You've got infrastructure here that could support traditional boat building, could train people in methods that are nearly extinct. You'd be willing to teach that?" "I've been looking for a permanent facility where I could train apprentices, preserve knowledge before my generation takes it to the grave like Thomas did." Catherine paused. "If you're serious about this, about honoring what this building represented, I'd be interested in partnering. Use your space, share the knowledge, create something that connects traditional craft to modern needs." The partnership formed carefully, built on shared understanding that this was about more than profit. Catherine relocated to Harborview the following spring, bringing equipment and expertise. They converted sections of the shipyard to small-scale boat building, traditional methods using hand tools and techniques that had been refined over centuries. The teaching component evolved naturally. Woodworkers and maritime enthusiasts started coming to learn, drawn by the rare opportunity to study traditional boat building in a facility designed for it. Caleb, now 10, became Catherine's informal assistant, learning skills that connected him to something Thomas Carlyle had understood, that some knowledge was worth preserving even when the world had moved on. Marcus found his own purpose over those months. He managed the shipyard's operations, handled the business side that allowed them to run sustainably while keeping fees accessible for students who couldn't afford expensive tuition. But he also learned alongside Caleb, discovering that working with wood and understanding how boats were designed satisfied something he hadn't known was missing. The money he'd found had been invested carefully. Some went to establishing a scholarship fund for traditional maritime craft education, ensuring that students like the person he'd been, broke and desperate, could still learn skills that mattered. Some went to maintaining the building properly, preventing the kind of neglect that had nearly destroyed it. The rest sat invested conservatively, providing security without extravagance. 2 years after Marcus had bought the shipyard for $420, they held a small celebration marking the building's transformation. Local people came, some who'd worked there under Thomas, others who'd watched it decay and were glad to see it alive again. Even Richard Brennan attended, accompanied by his son James, both wearing expressions of complicated acceptance. "My father would hate this," Richard said, watching demonstrations of traditional boat building. "He wanted this land for marina development, something profitable. But watching what you've built, I think maybe Thomas knew what he was doing when he hid that money." James was quieter, studying the restored equipment and the craftspeople learning skills his grandfather had dismissed as obsolete. "We wasted 40 years fighting over this," he said finally. "Time we could have spent building something that mattered instead of just trying to tear down what someone else built." After the celebration, Marcus and Caleb stood on the second-floor office where Thomas had worked, looking down at the assembly floor that now held activity and purpose again. The building breathed differently than it had when Marcus first entered, no longer abandoned but alive, serving a function Thomas would have recognized even if the specifics had evolved. "Do you think Mr. Carlyle knew someone like us would find his treasure?" Caleb asked. "I think he hoped. He created the puzzle, left the clues, trusted that whoever was desperate enough to buy a foreclosed shipyard would be thorough enough to find what he'd hidden." Marcus put his arm around his son's shoulders. "He gave us more than money and gold. He gave us purpose, something to build that's bigger than just ourselves." The years continued their steady progression. The shipyard became known among maritime craftspeople, a rare facility where traditional skills were taught and preserved. The business wasn't hugely profitable, but it was sustainable, employed local people, drew visitors who spent money in Harborview, and helped stabilize a town that had been slowly dying. Caleb flourished in ways Marcus could never have predicted when they'd arrived desperate and displaced. He became skilled in traditional boat building, developed a reputation for careful work that honored Thomas's standards. He talked about studying naval architecture in college, about finding ways to bridge traditional craft with modern design, about keeping the shipyard operating while expanding its mission. Marcus had used the remainder of Thomas's fortune carefully, investing in the building's restoration and the teaching programs, living modestly despite wealth that would have allowed luxury. He'd found purpose in the work, in preserving something Thomas had believed was worth dying to protect, in giving Caleb a foundation that went beyond financial security. Ernest Porter died peacefully at 87, his last words to Marcus a reminder that Thomas would have been proud. You understood what he was trying to preserve. Not just a building or money, but principles about craft and quality, and refusing to surrender when powerful people demand it. On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years after buying the shipyard at auction, Marcus sat in Thomas's restored office reading through the ship's logs that documented a century of boat building. The entries ended abruptly in January 1982, Thomas's final notation about closure and provision, the last words of a man preparing to hide his life's wealth in a chamber he might not live to open. But the story hadn't ended there. It had continued through Marcus's desperate purchase, through Caleb's discovery of the hidden door, through the choice to stand rather than sell, through years of careful restoration and teaching and preservation. Thomas's legacy hadn't died when he fell from that scaffolding. It had waited, patient as only buried things can be, for someone worthy to claim it. The shipyard stood solid in the evening light, its walls holding stories that spanned generations, its spaces filled with the sound of craft being practiced and taught. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through desperation and vision and the kind of courage that came from having nothing to lose except principles you refused to surrender. Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about hidden chambers and dead men's trusts, about choices made and ground held. He thought about Sarah dying too young, about Caleb losing his mother but gaining something through this place, about how tragedy and blessing could be woven together so tightly you couldn't separate them. The land kept its secrets still, the river flowing past the shipyard as it had for millennia, the oak tree standing where Thomas had buried his key, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had also given what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful, and people stubborn enough to do the building. As darkness settled over Harborview and the shipyard's lights glowed warm against the night, Marcus felt the weight of 5 years settle into something approaching peace. Not satisfaction exactly, because there was always more work to do, always knowledge to preserve and skills to teach. But contentment with choices made and ground held, with a son who'd found purpose in a building that had found new life. Thomas Carlyle's treasure had saved them from immediate desperation, but his real gift was understanding that inheritance meant more than receiving, it meant choosing to honor what had been entrusted to you, to build rather than simply consume, to preserve what deserved preservation even when the world had moved on to easier alternatives. The shipyard would stand long after Marcus was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you owned but what you built, not what you inherited but what you chose to protect and pass forward. Marcus stood in Thomas's office, holding logs that documented a life of careful work, feeling the continuity between that life and his own. The money and gold had been spent wisely, invested in restoration and teaching, used with more wisdom than Thomas had managed. The building breathed with purpose, its toxic legacy cleaned away, its spaces filled with people learning skills that would have died without this preservation. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in timber and tradition, in patient craftsmanship and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear. Thomas had held this ground until it could be passed to someone who'd understand. Marcus had held it until Caleb could claim it as his own heritage. Caleb would hold it for whoever came next, creating continuity that transformed individual struggle into something larger than any one life. The shipyard stood as proof that what was worth defending could be defended, that heritage could survive through choice and commitment, that sometimes desperate gambles made by broken people led to places nobody could have predicted but everyone could recognize as right. The building hummed in the evening quiet, alive in ways it hadn't been since Thomas's death, serving a function that honored what he'd built while adapting to present needs. The assembly floor where fishing boats had once taken shape now taught people how boats were designed and constructed, preserving methods most of the modern world had forgotten. Marcus locked the office that had been Thomas's, walking down to the assembly floor where a partially completed dory sat on sawhorses, Caleb's careful work evident in every plank and frame. His son was building his first solo project, applying skills Catherine had taught him, honoring standards Thomas would have recognized. The river flowed past the shipyard's dry dock, carrying tides that had lifted vessels for over a century, indifferent to human struggles but patient witness to the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved. The shipyard had survived because Marcus had chosen survival over surrender, had honored Thomas's trust over the easier path of taking money and walking away. That choice had made all the difference, had transformed what could have been simple windfall into something that served a community, that preserved heritage, that gave his son foundation built on more than financial security. The building stood because Marcus had stood, and standing had proven to be exactly what both he and the shipyard had needed. 10 years passed like tides across the harbor, each one leaving its mark on the shipyard the way water shapes timber. Marcus watched Caleb grow from the 8-year-old boy who'd helped him find Thomas Carlyle's hidden chamber to an 18-year-old young man whose hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent a decade learning traditional boat building. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you notice day by day, but when Marcus looked at photographs from that first desperate winter camping in the abandoned building, he barely recognized the scared man and frightened child they'd been. The shipyard had transformed with them. What had been toxic abandonment was now thriving preservation, what had been decay was now purpose. The main assembly floor operated daily, students learning to shape timber using techniques that predated power tools, craftspeople from across the country coming to study methods most of the world had forgotten. The teaching workshops ran year-round, the building breathing with the sound of mallets and hand planes, the smell of cedar and oak replacing the chemical residue that had poisoned the ground for decades. Caleb had become the shipyard's youngest certified boat builder at 17, approved by Catherine Morrison and a board of traditional maritime craftspeople who'd tested his skills and found them exceptional. He developed an intuitive understanding of how it responded to steam and pressure, could read grain patterns the way others read text. His first solo project, a 17-foot Whitehall rowing boat built using 19th-century methods, had been featured in maritime journals, his work studied by people trying to connect traditional craft with modern needs. Marcus had found his own rhythm over those years. He managed the shipyard's operations, handled the business side that allowed them to run sustainably while keeping tuition accessible for students who couldn't afford expensive programs. He'd also become something of an expert in historic maritime building preservation, consulting with other communities trying to save structures the economy had abandoned. The remainder of Thomas's fortune had been invested carefully. Some went to establishing a scholarship fund for traditional maritime education, ensuring that students like the person he'd been, broke and desperate, could still learn skills that mattered. Some went to maintaining the building properly, preventing the kind of neglect that had nearly destroyed it. The rest sat invested conservatively, providing security without extravagance, allowing them to make decisions based on principles rather than financial pressure. On a warm evening in late May, 15 years after Marcus had bought the shipyard at auction, they held what had become an annual tradition. The Carlisle Memorial Gathering, a day when the shipyard opened to the community, when boat builders demonstrated traditional techniques, when the building celebrated not just its survival but its rebirth as something Thomas would have recognized and valued. Richard Brennan attended, as he had for the past 7 years, his presence no longer uncomfortable but accepted. He was older now, fully retired, having handed his business operations to James, who'd proven less interested in development and more interested in maritime heritage preservation after seeing what Marcus had built. Thomas would have appreciated this, Richard said, watching Caleb teach a group of students how to fare a hull using hand planes and patience. Not because you're making money from it, but because you're keeping something alive that should have died when he did. Marcus had learned over the years that Richard's obsession with the shipyard had been about more than land or profit. It had been about his father's failure, about inherited anger that had defined 3 generations of Brennan men. Breaking that cycle had freed something in Richard, had allowed him to see the shipyard not as property stolen but as heritage preserved. "Your son seems genuinely committed to what we're doing here," Marcus observed, watching James document the teaching process with professional equipment. "He's establishing a Maritime Heritage Foundation, wants to save other buildings like this one before they're lost entirely. Says what you've done here proves that preservation can be economically viable if you're willing to prioritize purpose over profit." Richard paused. "He interviewed me last year about my family's history with the shipyard. First time I've talked honestly about the obsession that drove my father and grandfather. First time I've admitted it was always more about pride than principle." After Richard moved on to examine other demonstrations, Catherine Morrison approached with news that felt like validation. The American Boat Building Institute wants to use the shipyard as their primary teaching facility for traditional wooden boat construction. They'd bring students from across the country, provide funding for expansion, help us train the next generation of craftspeople. "That's exactly what Thomas wanted," Marcus said, feeling the weight of that recognition. "For this place to matter beyond his own lifetime, to serve a purpose that outlasted any individual." Catherine smiled. "You've honored his trust better than he probably imagined. Most people who find hidden money just spend it on themselves. You built something that serves a community." That evening, after the gathering had ended and the shipyard had quieted, Marcus found Caleb standing at the edge of the dry dock where the Kennebec River met the harbor. His son had grown tall, broader through the shoulders from years of physical work, but he still carried himself with the careful consideration he'd shown even as a child. "Mom would have liked this," Caleb said without preamble. "She always said you were at your best when you were building something, when you had purpose beyond just surviving." Marcus hadn't expected the conversation to turn to Sarah, but he welcomed it. They didn't talk about her often, but when they did, it felt important. "She would have been proud of what you've become. The craftsmanship, the patience, the way you teach others. I think about her sometimes when I'm working. The cancer took her too fast for me to remember much, but I remember she never gave up trying to stay with us. She fought until the end." Caleb turned to face his father. "You did the same thing with this place. You could have taken the easy money and left, but you fought for something that mattered. That's what she would have wanted." The words settled over Marcus like a benediction, acknowledgement that he'd honored not just Thomas Carlyle's trust but also Sarah's memory by choosing to stand rather than retreat. The shipyard had given him purpose when grief and poverty had nearly destroyed him, had given Caleb a foundation built on more than just financial security. The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the shipyard's story. Students who'd learned traditional boat building there established their own workshops, creating a network of craftspeople who valued sustainable methods and classic design. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Thomas's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. The money and gold had long since been fully invested or spent, their direct impact transformed into infrastructure and programs and scholarships that would outlive the physical currency. But their true value had never been the assets themselves, it had been the breathing room they'd provided, the space to build something meaningful rather than just survive. Marcus turned 55 at the shipyard, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the building's resurrection. Former students and current teachers, community members who'd watched the transformation, even Richard and James Brennan who'd made peace with history they couldn't change. The celebration felt less like a birthday and more like acknowledgement of journey completed, of ground held through stubbornness and grace. Caleb gave him a gift that day that made his throat tight, a wooden half-model of a boat, carved and finished by hand using techniques Thomas would have recognized. It was mounted on a plaque with an inscription Caleb had carved himself, "For the man who taught me that legacy isn't what you inherit, but what you choose to build." As the celebration wound down and evening settled over Harborview Harbor, Marcus walked alone through the shipyard's assembly floor, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had once been abandoned but now pulsed with purpose. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about hidden chambers and dead men's trusts, about choices made and ground held. The building had been waiting, Thomas's faith extending beyond death, the hidden fortune patient as only buried things can be. Marcus had found it at his lowest moment, had chosen to honor the trust it represented, had built something that transformed personal salvation into community resource. That was legacy in its truest form, not hoarding what you'd been given but investing it in something larger, not protecting heritage by sealing it away but by keeping it alive through practice and teaching. Thomas had made the mistake of dying alone with his knowledge, but his hidden wealth had funded the correction of that mistake, had created a place where skills were shared and preserved and passed forward. One afternoon in late September, as Caleb prepared to leave for college, he'd been accepted to Webb Institute to study naval architecture, with plans to return and apply modern engineering to traditional methods. A visitor arrived who brought the final piece of closure Marcus hadn't known he needed. An elderly woman introduced herself as Margaret Carlyle, Thomas's niece, the last living member of his family. She'd heard about the shipyard's restoration, had traveled from Boston to see what had become of her uncle's legacy. Uncle Thomas never married, never had children, Margaret said as Marcus showed her around the restored facility. The shipyard was his family, his craft was his children. When he died and I learned he'd hidden his assets rather than leave them to his siblings, I was angry. Thought it was spite, that he didn't trust us. She paused in the assembly floor, watching students work on a traditional dory, their movements careful and precise under Catherine's instruction. But seeing this, I understand what he was trying to preserve. He didn't hide the money from family, he hid it for the craft itself, trusting that whoever found it would value what he'd valued. He left a note, Marcus said, pulling out his phone to show her a photograph of Thomas's letter. Said whoever found it should use it with more wisdom than he managed. Margaret read it silently, tears tracking down her weathered face. That sounds like Thomas. Always hard on himself, always believing he should have done more. But he did plenty. This building stands because he protected it, and now it serves because you honored what he protected. Before she left, Margaret gave Marcus something she'd been carrying, Thomas's personal journal from his final years, a record of his thoughts as he watched his industry die and prepared to seal away his family's fortune. Reading it that evening, Marcus found passages that spoke to the loneliness of being the last practitioner of a dying craft, the weight of knowing that skills refined over generations would disappear when you died. I'm preparing the chamber today, Thomas had written in January 1982. Everything is ready, the money and gold secured, the safe installed, the clues arranged for whoever might be clever enough to find them. I tell myself this is about protecting assets from those who'd misuse them, but truthfully, it's about faith. Faith that someone will come along who understands that some things are worth preserving even when the world has moved on. I had to believe that craftsmanship and quality and patient work still matter to someone, somewhere. Marcus closed the journal, recognizing in Thomas's words the same desperation he'd felt when he'd placed that $420 bid at auction. Both of them had been gambling on faith, Thomas that someone would find and honor his legacy, Marcus that buying an abandoned shipyard might somehow provide shelter and hope for his son. Both gambles had paid off in ways neither could have predicted. 20 years after Marcus had arrived in Harborview with Caleb and nothing else, the shipyard had become more than just a teaching facility. It was a living museum, a working boatyard, a community anchor that employed local people and drew visitors from around the world. The American Boat Building Institute's partnership had brought resources and recognition, but the heart of the operation remained what Marcus and Catherine had built, a place where traditional skills were practiced and preserved. Caleb returned after college with his degree and new ideas about how traditional methods could inform modern design. He took over as lead instructor, teaching classes on classical boat building while also developing programs that integrated sustainable materials and contemporary engineering. His work bridged past and present in ways Thomas would have appreciated, honoring tradition while acknowledging that craft had to evolve to survive. James Brennan's Maritime Heritage Foundation grew into a regional force for preservation, saving 3 other historic boatyards and establishing a network of craftspeople committed to traditional methods. He and Caleb became collaborators, their family's decades-long conflict transformed into partnership built on shared values. On a cool October morning, 25 years after buying the shipyard at auction, Marcus stood on the dock watching Caleb and a team of students launch a traditionally built lobster boat they'd spent 2 years constructing. The vessel sat in the water perfectly, its lines graceful, its construction sound, testament to skills that had nearly been lost but had been preserved through stubbornness and faith. Richard Brennan stood beside him, old now and moving carefully, but still present for moments that mattered. My father would have seen this boat and dismissed it as obsolete, not worth the time to build when fiberglass is cheaper and faster. But watching it sit in the water, seeing how beautiful it is, I understand what Thomas was protecting. He was protecting the knowledge, Marcus said. The understanding that some things are worth doing well even when doing them quickly would be easier. That's a lesson my family needed to learn. Took us 3 generations to figure it out, but better late than never. As the boat moved into the harbor under its own power, students rowing with the practiced rhythm Catherine had taught them, Marcus felt the weight of 25 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, but closure on the journey that had started with -$, and an eviction notice and had led to this moment of quiet triumph. The shipyard stood solid against the afternoon sky, its walls holding stories that span more than a century, its spaces filled with people learning and teaching and preserving what deserved preservation. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through desperation meeting opportunity, through stubbornness meeting grace, through one man's hidden fortune meeting another man's willingness to honor the trust it represented. Thomas Carlyle had died protecting his life's work, had hidden his fortune as a final act of faith that someone would come along who'd understand what was worth saving. That someone had been Marcus, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd almost chosen the easier path of taking money and walking away. But he'd listened to a dead man's trust, had honored principles about craft and quality and refusing to surrender when powerful people demanded it. The shipyard would stand long after Marcus was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in timber and tradition, in patient craftsmanship and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear, in the understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. Caleb would carry it forward, and his students after him, creating continuity that turned accident into intention, desperation into purpose, one man's hidden treasure into a community's living heritage. The money and gold had been spent wisely, invested in preservation and teaching, used with more wisdom than Thomas had managed because Marcus had understood what Thomas had missed, that knowledge hoarded dies, but knowledge shared multiplies across generations. As Marcus stood watching the traditionally built boat move through Harborview Harbor, he felt the presence of everyone who'd made this moment possible. Sarah, who'd fought cancer with courage that taught him what standing for something looked like. Thomas, who'd protected his craft until death and trusted that someone would continue what he'd started. Ernest and Catherine and all the craftspeople who'd chosen to preserve skills the world was forgetting. The river flowed past the shipyard as it had for millennia, carrying tides that lifted vessels in time itself, indifferent to human struggles but patient witness to the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved. The land had held its secrets and then yielded them to someone worthy, and Marcus had proven worthy not by finding them but by honoring the trust they represented. The shipyard stood as proof that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible, that heritage could survive through choice and commitment, that sometimes broken people stumbling into good fortune used it to build something that mattered beyond their own salvation. The building breathed in the autumn air, alive in ways it hadn't been since Thomas's death, serving a function that honored what he'd built while adapting to present needs. Marcus locked the shipyard that evening, his hand on doors that had been repaired and strengthened, walking property that was his through law and through choice and through 25 years of stubborn devotion to something larger than himself. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before anyone had built ships here, that would continue after all current struggles were forgotten. The shipyard that had almost been lost was reborn, and the man who'd saved it had been saved in return. That was the real treasure Thomas had hidden, not just money and gold, but the opportunity for redemption, for purpose, for building something that transformed personal desperation into community blessing. The inheritance had been claimed and honored, the trust kept, the legacy passed forward to hands that would hold it carefully and teach others to do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.